Okay, it is Saturday morning, June 9th, 2007. I am Rob Campbell, and I'm sitting here in the Bump Lounge at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. And with me, I have Gary Johnson. Gary, could we just start with you, setting aside the T28 for just a minute? Could you just tell us who you are, what your background is, short biography, some idea of your career, if you would, please?
Sure. I am basically a South Dakota native. I grew up from my first year onward in eastern South Dakota. Graduated from Watertown High School, stayed there in Watertown all of my growing up years, and then having an interest in science, particularly electrical and electronic things, I decided to go to the School of Mines and become an electrical engineer. And I did. I graduated in 1966 and left, got married and left the school and went to work in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and later on in Minneapolis, working for two different electronics companies, Collins Radio Company at that time, now Rockwell. And after that in Minneapolis was Honeywell. Well, that was the time period of 1966 through 1970. In 1970, the summer of 1970, it was kind of a slack period in the defense industry, which was Honeywell's, the department I worked in at Honeywell was largely into defense work, and I had a great job. I mean, it was called applied research, and basically taking ideas that seemed good from a military or a security standpoint, like developing security sensors and things, just taking them off the wall concepts and seeing if they would work, and taking them as far as going out into the fields that Honeywell owned in Minnesota and testing out these ideas. Well, coming from a job like that was very interesting, but the job market was kind of tight and the funding was kind of tight in military spending. So I went to the 1970 alumni reunion here in Rapid City and talked with the head of the Department of Electrical Engineering at that time, Bill Hickson. And as I was climbing up M Hill, Bill Hickson was up there too, and asked him if there was any possibilities of assistantships in coming back to grad school. And he said, well, he thought there might be. My grades were just kind of, I figured, marginal. About a 3-point average is what I had, just slightly under a 3-point average. So, you know, I was not a star candidate for graduate studies, but you know, I was certainly eligible, and I decided that I'd like to go back to school after being out for a while, and especially at a time when the job market was kind of weak, and Honeywell decided they would give me a leave of absence that I asked for. So I said I'd work there for 2 years, and I came back to the School of Mines and got an assistantship working for Paul Smith in the Institute of Atmospheric Science. And as Paul is a old-time electrical engineer anyway, who's specialized in the atmospheric work and radar. So he was a great guy to work for, and I thought it was wonderful because everybody's interested in the weather. So if you could study the weather and study electronics and do all of that stuff at the same time and get paid for it, and still have a job to go back to, why not? And at that time I had a son, my only son, was already coming up on 3 years old. I didn't own a house, so it had no real attachments to the Twin Cities, and we came back here. Funny thing, just so one of those little tidbits of information, but the real estate market was really in the dumps in Rapid City. There were repossessed houses all over the place. And don't you suppose for $500 down, we bought a house, repossessed, 3 bedrooms, attached garage for $12,300. And there I was making about $125 a month and bought a house. And a graduate student, so.
Can't do better than that.
No, it still makes me shudder when I think about it. But it was great. I couldn't afford a house in Minneapolis because I wasn't getting enough money for that, or I hadn't saved enough. So I go into poverty living and still am able to afford to buy a house in Rapid City.
So this is the fall of 1970 that you came back to Rapid City?
Yeah, September of 1970. Came back to Rapid City, started my graduate work.
And you got a graduate degree
Yep.
in?
In electrical engineering, working under the direction of Paul Smith, my major professor, and my boss in the institute. His interest being in radar and atmospheric research. He directed my thesis topic, which was an atmospheric airborne telemetry system to transmit airborne data to the ground in real time, so that at that time the Institute was big into cloud seeding research. And cloud seeding research was kind of a big topic, but the technology for gathering data at the same time and controlling things was pretty crude. So I developed a simple telemetry system that would gather the data that one of the research airplanes, not the T28, but it was called the Piper Aztec, that had cloud seeding flares on it, and it was not a primary seeder. It was a primary research airplane, but it wasn't researching hail because it wasn't equipped for that. It was more or less cloud penetration into rainstorms.
So, did you come here thinking about the T28? Was this
No.
was this on your schedule? When did you start working on the T28?
I have to go back to the book just a little bit, but I noticed in 1971 I had one little task that was assigned to me to help repair an instrument that was flying on the T-28 at that time. And I believe it was Wayne Sand that was had already been hired by the Institute at that time. So I noticed that in 1971 there was a note referring to Wayne. But my primary job at that time was working with the radars at the radar site east of Rapid City, and enabling the gathering of data from the radars and putting them on computers and computer tape for analysis in semi-real time and later. And so I was kind of a radar guy. The way I got into that job was that as I completed my degree requirements in 1 year in 1971, one of the other staff members decided to go pursue a degree himself, in an advanced degree at Ohio State. Jim Boardman was his name. And he had done a lot of work in the computer area, much more than I was. I'm not a computer guy by nature, so I got involved with this PDP-8 mini computer, which is one of the very first called mini computers that was $80,000 expensive and as big as a supercomputer today. But Jim Boardman went to grad school. Paul Smith asked me if I would like to take a 1-year temporary appointment while he was away. And I said, sure, good work. I talked to Honeywell and said, can I extend my leave of absence? They said, sure. So Jim Boardman never came back. And eventually, we had a talk with Dick Schleusner, the director of the Institute at that time, and I think with Paul Smith's concurrence, they decided to, put me on staff. So there was I was taking over Jim Boardman's position, but I had a different set of skills, not really strong in the computer area, but more so in the electronics hardware. Well, shortly after that, a fellow who was also a double E on staff by the name of Bill Myers left. And Bill Myers had been working on the T28 instrumentation. And so it was in its early stages then too. There was a data recorder called the DL622 made by a small company out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that was recording data on a digital format and on tape, endless loop cartridges. Just recorded basic stuff. But Bill left, and then there was a void there. And I took over, I believe that was in 1973. I could verify the dates here by looking at the notebooks a little bit more, but in 1972-73 time frame is when I was given the opportunity to start working with the instruments on the T28, primarily what they called then the hail sensor. There was various attempts with the T28 to record something about the hail characteristics of the hail that the plane was flying through. And you know, when your plane is traveling 200 miles an hour and you've got hailstones hitting it, and what are you supposed to do about finding out what these hailstones are all about? What are they look like? How big are they? How hard are they? And there were some instruments built, very crude mechanical things that were impact sensors, and so you could actually measure the impact, the momentum of impact of the hail. But those things were pretty unsuccessful because they would always freeze up. You know, you'd get a coating of ice on them and they would just be not very operational, very insensitive. You'd have to hit them with a hammer in order to make them record anything. So the optical hail sensor was a concept. I'm quite sure that Paul Smith probably conceived of the idea first, but I don't know where that first came from. It was a graduate student's thesis topic to develop the optics for an instrument that could record the shadows of a hailstone as it was flying past the wings of a T-20 or of an airplane. And so the optics were developed by a physics grad student, and the electronics was developed to some extent by Bill Myers, but it never worked. For a lot of practical reasons, there was just electronic interference inside there, and it was just a mess electrically. So I took that, and that was my first project, was to make it work. So I completely rebuilt it, the darn thing. John Lee, who was the aircraft mechanic for most of the T-28's history, was very good at crafting things, and he put together the box of this hail sensor that was hardened and able to withstand hail impacts, and fabricated the supports that would support all of the electronics that I had built inside this. And it started, we did gather some data with that a little bit at a time. It gradually became more of a useful instrument, recording the size and the number of hailstones that the T-28 would fly through. And there aren't many hailstones up in there when you talk about numbers per cubic meter. You know, there's just a few what you might call hailstones, and they seem to be pretty prevalent in the atmosphere when they come down and hit the ground, because there's a lot of them there. But when you take a picture of the atmosphere, there's not really very dense populations of hailstones there.
Now, is this the same instrument that Ted Cannon worked on?
No, that's completely different.
That was a raindrop sensor.
Yes.
Is that right, or
It was
looking for smaller things?
It was a totally optical film recording device that we called it the Canon camera, and it was for the purpose of distinguishing ice from rain optically, and it was very complicated, a mechanical wonder. This thing would take pictures of hailstones and raindrops as they were flying through two pylons that were mounted underneath the left wing, the T28. And that camera was operated with a movie camera body, and it would take 35 millimeter pictures, one at a time, but very fast, and had a rotating mirror in there so that the motion of these hailstones as they were flying right through this sensitive area would be stopped. And then a strobe light had to go on at exactly the right time so that when these raindrops or hailstones were right in the field of view, that the flash would go on, the mirror was rotating, and it would be kind of stopped in motion there. And you could distinguish by the number of reflections of this strobe light whether or not it was a solid particle or a liquid raindrop. And that Canon camera is a big instrument, and it took up a lot of space on the left wing. So we traded off that left wing space was also this part where the hail sensor occupied. There just was not enough real estate on the airplane to have them both flying at the same time.
Oh, so it was one or the other?
One or the other.
Wow.
Yep.
So do you actually swap it out, at different times during the same summer, or from day to day, or year to year, or project to project?
Usually it was year to year or project to project because of the interest that was, or the type of data that was the target in a particular project might dictate what instrument was being flown. Now, cloud seeding research with having to distinguish between the liquid and the ice particles up there probably meant that you'd want to have the camera. But if you were looking at pure hail research and you're looking at the device, or looking at particles that are 5 millimeters in diameter and bigger, then that's the definition of hail anyway, and you can't really have liquid particles that are much bigger than 5 millimeters without them breaking up. So the hail spectrometer could not distinguish liquid from water or liquid from ice, but it did so on the basis of size. If you have recording an image or a particle that happens to be 3/4 of an inch in diameter, that's not liquid, because liquid will not hold together that big. And so that's the way it was decided to measure hailstones, was on the basis of size.
Using this electronic instrument?
Yeah.
What you're calling the hail sensor?
Yeah.
Can you just tell me basically how this hail sensor works? Give me the short lecture on this.
Sure. The hail sensor uses a laser, which and it was one of the early lasers, kind of a big thing made out of helium neon, a vacuum tube in there, and it would generate a small beam of light about, a couple of millimeters in diameter, coming out circular. And through these optics that this graduate student, by the name of Bill Shaw, by the way, that was Bill Shaw's project, through the optics, he would expand that into a fan and then reshape the beam so that it would become kind of a sheet of light. Yeah, just a flat sheet of light.
Like a vertical, a vertical sheet. But it would come out up and down.
But it would come down up and down, and it would be parallel, so that, it wouldn't be a diverging beam like a flashlight might give.
Right.
It would be a straight beam, so that if you stick your finger through it over here, and at very low power, so it wouldn't hurt anything, but if you stick your finger through the beam over here, the shadow looks just like your finger over here, same size. Well, if you fly through, throw a piece of, say, a ping pong ball or something round like that through it, you can have a number of sensors on the other side. recording that light, and when it gets interrupted by something flying through it, those sensors become aware of the fact that there's no light anymore. But the ones next to it, there is light, so it's a very sharp shadow that it casts.
And what kind of resolution did you have on those sensors? Do you
Those
remember?
sensors were 0.9 millimeters apart. So that was our resolution, was just under 1 millimeter. And so if there were 5 of those light sensors shadowed at any one time, that would be basically about 4.5 millimeters in diameter. Anything bigger than 5 sensors shadowed simultaneously, he says, aha, this is a particle we're interested in, and it's probably ice because it's big.
And this was all electronic?
It was all electronically detected.
Was this digital? Did you get an analog signal from these sensors, or was it either just on or off?
It was, the sensors themselves were analog, but we immediately converted it to digital. So that was basically a digital sensing device there, which would say how wide or how big a diameter is this particle.
And the result was recorded inside the plane onto digital tape? Has a digital...
Yes. There was a lot of electronics under the wing that was converting this digital signal and discriminating from on the basis of size and so forth, that then once it determined electronically that this was probably a valid particle, boom, it would send that data to the computer.
Oh, I see. So really all you were recording was particle sizes?
Yeah.
That was all processed right away?
Yes, it was processed right away and reduced right away, so that we would not have an individual count. We would have counts of the numbers of sizes. So there were, I believe, and I have to research it again, but I believe that there were 14 categories of sizes. We would have the smallest, which was say 4.5 to 5.5 millimeter diameter. That would be category 1. And then from 5.5 to 6.5 approximately, category 2, and so forth, all the way up to the top category, which was something on the order of 2 inches in diameter. It says, okay, if this is 2 inches in diameter or bigger, it goes into the top category.
So what was your smallest category again? Up to 4.5 millimeters, you said?
No, that was the low end, 4.5 to 5.5 millimeters in diameter.
Oh, I see.
That was the smallest we would record.
And this was in the hail range, as you were saying, because the water droplets would be much smaller.
Right. Water droplets have the characteristic of when they grow in a cloud, if they get to that diameter of approximately 5 millimeters, that's when they begin to break up into smaller particles.
So was the data storage a real bottleneck in those days?
Yeah.
Did you reduce it right away because you just didn't have that many megabytes to throw onto the tape or the digital recorder?
Well, the hail wasn't that difficult to record because we were reducing it in real time.
Yeah.
We would record, say, up to 999 particles in category 1, 99 particles in category 2, and progressively smaller so that we would record in the largest sizes up to from 0 to 9. And so those were a relatively small number of digits, and we would once per second that number would be reduced, would be recorded on tape. So when you do that, that's not very voluminous. The other particle types of information on the T28 was a real bottleneck for data storage. So we actually had 2 tape recorders running at some times there. One of them recording images of devices, which was huge data, and the other one was more or less the reduced data or the slow-moving data that you don't have to record a lot of.
You said images of devices?
Yeah, because we've had more than one instrument that was capable of taking pictures on the airplane or recording images. The camera was not an electronic device. That was just purely film and manually had to be reduced and looked at. There was another instrument, or one instrument called the Nolenberg probe, or built by a company called Particle Measurement Systems in Boulder. And a scientist by the name of Bob Nolenberg invented this probe that was originally designed to fly to some of the planets in outer space and record characteristics of the planetary atmospheres. He started his own company as a spin-off of that research to record atmospheric particles. And he would take pictures electronically of these shadows, just like I described here in our hail sensor. So that his difference, though, was that as a particle was flying through this beam of light, every microsecond or so, he would take a new picture or take a new recording of what that shadow looked like, so that if you knew that once every microsecond you'd be recording every one of those sensors, the optical sensors, you could recreate what that particle looked like if you knew how fast you were going. So if you're going 100 meters per second and you take a picture of the shadow once every microsecond, after a certain number of slices, you can recreate the shape of that particle as it was flying through. And that's what his sensors did, so that takes a lot of data.
Almost like a CAT scan or something like that.
Yeah, almost like a CAT scan.
Yeah.
We built on that.
So those, just sorry to interrupt, but those were not images like from a camera, but sort of sensor recordings like the hail sensor.
Yeah.
I see.
The hail sensor on the first go-around was strictly a device that recorded the size and the number of hailstones that it encountered. And we used a lot of electronics to distinguish between artifacts and real stuff. But we never had an image. We never knew what they looked like. We knew how big in diameter they were. That was it. So there was some question about the validity of some of these things that we were recording. And so I developed another technique to expand that data into making images from the hail sensor, much like the Nolenberg probes did. And the intent there was to determine if the things that we were seeing were real.
Yeah, now you said artifacts. What kind of artifacts were you dealing with?
One of the most common forms of artifacts was shed ice. We've got these pylons hanging underneath the left wing, and as they're flying through a storm, they're collecting ice. Well, as some hailstones might hit that, that's going to shed some of that ice. So all of a sudden you've got other contamination flying through the sensitive area, and it might look like it's going to be, gosh, a baseball-sized hailstone, but it might just be a piece of ice falling off there. So we're trying to determine if that's an artifact. That would be, if you take an image of that, you can tell, okay, this is way, way beyond the realm of a spherical ice ball flying through the air. This is something shedding off.
Yeah, and was there any way to avoid that shedding? Because you needed the pylons, right?
Yeah, you need the pylons.
You needed something to hold the sensors.
The only way to avoid that shedding would have been to put a lot of heat on the front end of these devices so that they would shed water rather than ice, and more frequently so that it would not contaminate it. But it takes so much heat, we wouldn't have enough power to actually create a hot enough surface to reduce that artifact. So we had to pretty much accept it. But then the next challenge was to detect it.
So you were saying that you went to sort of the next level of actually getting images from these same sensors, or
Yes.
from a similar set of sensors?
No, it was actually the same sensors I was using to record both the reduced data, the 14 categories of different hailstones, once per second, plus continuously, not once per second, but continuously recording what the images looked like. So if we see that there's an interesting part of this storm here where there's recording quite a few hailstones, then you want to take a look at what those images look like and say, are these real hailstones, or are they contamination due to ice shedding and other things?
So you said you were taking basically continuous readings from
Yes.
these sensors. So was that an analog sort of system, or was that also digital and every microsecond, or how did that work?
That was also converted analog into digital, just like the bulk sensing and the recording of the categories. So it was it was kind of a hybrid, analog and digital technique.
And at what kind of speed were you taking those images, did you say?
On the hail, we took a slice or a picture once every 10 microseconds.
Okay.
10 microseconds, when you're traveling 100 meters per second, turns out to be once every millimeter of air travel. So if you take a picture of this shadow once every millimeter of air travel, then you can recreate, within a 1 millimeter resolution of what the shape of that ice ball might be like.
So how soon in the project did you develop that capability of doing the imaging? Was that
I
soon?
wish you hadn't asked me that.
I mean, was this decades later or soon after, or?
No, it was in the middle 80s.
Oh, okay.
So it was about a 10,
Oh, so quite a bit later.
quite a bit later, yeah.
So, do you remember what projects you were working on in the early years?
Well, at the very early years, yeah. It was the Northeast Colorado experiment called ENRI, National Hail Research Experiment, and I got in on working with that when the T28 would travel in the summertime to Cheyenne or to Laramie to be based and fly into storms. They're detected on radar at this little northeastern Colorado town of Grover. I'm sure you've heard about all of the stories of Grover, and the meteorologists like Dennis Mussel and others would basically spend their summers in Grover, Colorado at the site where the radar was. And Cheyenne, Wyoming was the place where the T28 was based out of, that probably 40 or 50 miles away from Grover. But it was also Laramie for a couple of years. Laramie has a very nice facility, and it's also owned by the University of Wyoming. So it has a nice research collaboration there by having the T28, if it's possible, to base it at that airport in their hangar. And we did that for a couple of years too. So my first recollections were the Wyoming, Colorado area where the T28 was flying. And that was where the first use of the hail sensor was. That was my first reason for being a part of the T28, was to make this hail sensor work.
So how much of your work at IAS was the T28? Was that the majority of it? Was this just one small project out of many, or?
No, that was the bulk of it. It started out, I was in weather radar, helping develop some instruments to help record weather radar data. But after the early 70s, 72 or 73 and onward, it gradually got to be almost exclusive T28 work.
And how long did you work at IAS?
Well, since I was a grad student, that was basically my beginning in fall of 1970. But on staff of the fall of 1971, got on staff, and that continued up until when did I retire? It was 3 years ago this summer.
So
That was 04.
04. So what was it like working at IAS back in the days? Let's say the 70s generally. Where were you on campus, for one thing?
There was a group. At that time, there were a few engineers under the wing of Paul Smith, and he would have some graduate students as well as computer people working for him. It was called the engineering group, and Paul Smith was the head of the engineering group.
Within IAS?
Within IAS, yeah. And it was a great place to work. I mean, it was very similar to the type of environment I had come from at Honeywell as a an engineer there working in applied research. And as a matter of fact, a little aside there, that Honeywell, you know, I had worked at the IAS for about 4 or 5 years, and the folks at Honeywell kept saying, well, you want to come back to work? And finally, I had to say, you know, I think I found my niche. I want to stay at the Institute of Atmospheric Sciences. And so I ended up being on leave of absence for a lot longer period of time than I ever worked for Honeywell.
And you never went back?
And I never went back.
Okay.
Although I have fond memories of Honeywell, but the work at the Institute was of that same type. It was just fascinating. The recording of atmospheric information, and especially severe storm data, is a very interesting thing, especially for a guy who's an electrical type engineer. I mean, the meteorologists, they study all of this stuff, but you know, we're people who are double E's, they get to record, or they use the instruments that actually record some of the phenomena. And being interested in weather and having some skills in the electrical and electronic world, you know, that's just a great combination. Most of the time, an electrical engineer doesn't get out of the office much. Depends on what kind of a field of electrical you're in, but a lot of double E work is done indoors. And I had an opportunity to work indoors during the wintertime and outdoors during the summertime. Great.
So where did you work here on campus while you were doing the indoor work? Were you over in McClory in that time? Is that where all of IAS was, or?
Well, the IAS has moved a number of times in my tenure. Started out, the IAS was in the Mineral Industries building. And then the Mineral Industries building got occupied with the Mineral Industries, and I think IAS got kicked out, or I believe that was moved to McClory at the beginning, and the years I don't remember. But there wasn't enough room in McClory for everybody else either, so the engineering group took over a whole wing of Day Hall, the dormitory. And so we had a nice set of offices there. In fact, as my graduate work in the fall of 1970 started, and that's where my graduate office, my desk was there. I shared an office, shared a dorm room, but it was 2 desks in there with me and my roommate, buddy, classmate in grad school, a guy by the name of Bjarne Roland from Norway. And we were grad students together and taking most of the same classes together and shared an office together. And then when I began working on staff, I stayed in that same wing. And that continued for a number of years, and I can't remember when it actually, we had to get out of Day Hall. But there was room made available in the basement of McClory for the electronics lab, and my office and the pilot's office there. McClory was going through a renovation then too. They had some air conditioning installed and electrical upgrades and everything. And a part of that, I was able to contribute to the design of this lab. So I had it built to my specifications largely, so that it was a good place for electronic development. And during the wintertime, we could take instruments indoors, work on them, and then carry them back to the airplane, and in the summertime put them in the field.
So my sense is that IAS was a pretty big group at that time.
It was pretty big. I don't recall the total staff counts, but you know, it's probably in the neighborhood of 30, 35 maybe. There were radar technicians at the radar site, keeping the radars going. Electronics guys like myself, graduate students who were also in meteorology or physics or double E, and a number of meteorologists of different specialties. So it was just a dynamic group and a lot of fun to work with.
So whose baby was the T28? I mean, whose project was it? Do you know what I mean? When it came down to it, was Paul the PI? Or was it just the director's or how, you know, how did that work?
Well, and I wasn't directly involved, so I'm
Sure.
taking from what I've gathered over the years, but it was the brainchild of Dick Schleusner and probably some of his contemporaries there who thought that it might be a good idea to try to record what's really going on inside a hailstorm. And Dick Schleusner was a very practical-minded engineer type person and very good administrator, just a wonderful guy to work with and for. And he knew a lot of people, high-powered individuals in the industry as well as the academic world there doing research. So it was either him or he and a few others who probably came up with this brainchild of actually being able to fly through hailstorms and gather data. But he knew enough to enlist experts from around the whole world, I suppose, but basically in this country, that did the engineering studies, did the actual modifications, decided what kind of an airplane they could get. As I understand it, Wayne Sand worked for Dick Schleusner when he was in Montana, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dick knew Wayne Sand and kind of recruited him to fly this thing after it had become developed. And so I believe Paul Smith at that time was largely into radar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he had an immediate strong influence into the T28 at that time.
Right, but you reported, at least in those days, to Paul, right?
Yes.
Because you were in the engineering group for quite some time, or for?
Well, for all the time.
Okay.
Although there was no engineering group after Paul became the director, the group structure just got to be too cumbersome because there wasn't enough people to actually form a group.
Mm-hmm.
So then that kind of went by the wayside. But I had worked for Paul more directly, I think, throughout my whole tenure.
Yeah. So what was Paul like as a boss?
Fantastic. Yeah.
Don't worry, I won't tell Paul.
No, I think I respect him as a boss and as a co-worker and as a person just immensely. He was smart enough to give people all the freedom they could possibly use to pursue things, and he still would expect results, and he would get it most of the time. I think that there couldn't be a better guy for me to work for, anyway. I mean, other people might not be able to work in that kind of an environment very well, but I thought it was just something that was fabulous. So Paul was a great guy.
He wrote some peppery memos I have read in the, he was not a bland bureaucrat.
No.
Is this my mistake, or was he kind of peppery back in the day?
Well, I'm not sure what topics you're referring to. I mean, very opinionated, and he's a very smart guy to develop with the opinions that he does have.
I'm just saying his memos were fun because he'd actually say what he meant. He would politely tell people when he thought they were off base, and yeah, it's not nearly as painful reading his old memos as it is often reading old bureaucratic memos in historical archives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's got an excellent way of stating things. And,
So you did go out in the field in the summertime?
yes.
Almost every summertime, or?
Almost. There were a few exceptions. I took 1 year off. In fact, I actually quit the Institute of Atmospheric Sciences and went to work for a company that I helped form in 1976 and 77, I believe it was that year, academic year. I formed, along with two other electrical types, double E types that I'd met at school and become friends with, and fraternity brothers. We formed Dakota Data Services, a computer company developing time-sharing services out of Rapid City, South Dakota, for people to use our computer by telephone. You know, it was one of the first early time-sharing companies, and probably the only one that was based out of South Dakota. And for 10 years that company existed, but I took 1 year and actually quit the institute and was working full-time for Dakota Data Services. And however, I was able to still work as a consultant and part-time work for the institute, although not an employee.
Even during that 1 year?
Yeah.
Okay. But when you were out in the field, what were your general duties out there? I mean, obviously you're a ground guy.
Yeah.
But what did you do while you were in the field?
The first thing going to the field was to prepare the airplane after, I mean, at the very beginning of a field project, was to test each of the instruments on the airplane to make sure that it was functioning. And that was almost a daily function, but you wouldn't have to do it as thoroughly after the first series of tests there. So you would end up checking the performance of the instrumentation and the computers and so forth. That was a beginning of project and a once per day. Now, there was a lot of time just standing by, waiting for weather to happen. So after the plane was on the ground and in place, ready to go, and there was nothing more to do. There were a lot of times when some of the scientists would want to have the instruments constantly being tested and turning them on all the time and everything. I'm kind of a superstitious guy in a way. I figure, you know, if it works, don't screw with it. And
don't test it 5 more times.
Right, yeah, because you're going to wear it out and then it ain't going to work. And so there were some of those struggles between the types of people who were using the data and the types of guys like myself who were actually generating the data or responsible for the instruments. So as it turned out, that part, I was content to check things out in the morning, and if they worked okay, I would be willing to shut things off and wait for the weather to happen. And then after an afternoon where a thunderstorm occurred and the T28 was called to go fly through it and everything, then after landing, it would be a matter of downloading the data. Sometimes in the early days, it was taking the tapes out. And then we would have to make the preparations to reduce that data and repair the damage, because almost every time the plane would fly through a hailstorm, something would get damaged or knocked out of whack a little bit, because hail just does that. And you've got some instruments that are very sensitive and can't be made less sensitive because of the parameters of what they measure. So if you end up with a very small wire that is a sensing element and it gets hit by a hailstone, it's going to break. And that's something that if you make that wire bigger, it's going to actually detect or reduce its capability to do what its job is.
So were you responsible for the functioning of all the instruments on the airplane if you were out there?
In the early days, we had 2 electrical type people, myself and one other engineer or technician who was supplied by NCAR. The NCAR person was in charge of the imaging instruments, or the ones that I told you about earlier, the Nolenberg probes. And that was his only function in life, basically, was to make sure those probes were working and gathering data. And then my job was to see that the other instruments on the plane would be working. Also, one thing that I should mention, it's kind of interesting about how the data was reduced in the first place, because the School of Mines in the early 70s had a mainframe type computer. And it was not something that you could access remotely. There was no telephone or other access, no networking. So you would have to take data and programs and load them into the computer and do the processing in a batch fashion. So when we were down in Colorado or in Wyoming with the T28, after a research flight, we'd have to take the tapes, put them on a bus overnight to Rapid City, where they would get into town about midnight. And Jerry Halverson was the primary guy who would take those tapes and read them into the computer, process the data, generate some plots, analog plots of what the data looked like, and then transmit them back to Laramie or Cheyenne, Wyoming by the early forms of a fax machine. So we'd end up with fax copies of what our data looked like from the day before. So it was a very cumbersome process, and we depended on transmitting data by bus.
So you had a lot more instruments than just the hail sensor
Yeah,
to maintain and to check out.
yeah.
But how many sensors typically were on the T28?
Well,
I've seen these lists. It's a
Yeah.
long list, right?
yeah, it's quite a number of things, and some of them are multiples, like thermometers, for instance. We'd have two thermometers using different techniques to measure temperature. So if one doesn't work in a certain environment, the other one may. So we have two pressure sensors, so you could measure how high in the atmosphere you were, and airspeed sensors, multiples of those. A lot of it was redundant just from the standpoint of trying to make sure that you got the critical data and by having more than one instrument to record it. But here I was just looking at the number of channels that we would have on the early data system. 31 channels. Well, that's not quite 31 total instruments there, but yeah, certainly over 25 instruments that we were recording data from within a storm. Some of them were things like aircraft navigation data, so you could tell after the fact where that plane was, how high and what location, and other things were strictly like the temperature, the icing rate, liquid and water content.
Now, a lot of these were standard instruments that people had used and tested out well before the T28, right?
Yes. Yeah, so there were not many instruments that were specifically developed for the T28. The hail sensor was one.
Right. The Canon camera, was
the
that
Canon
for
camera.
the T28?
Well, there were two models of the Canon camera. One of them was developed for a glider. The NCAR actually flew. So the glide, it was a totally different shape, but Ted Cannon did have a camera on the NCAR glider as well. But the pressure instruments, we would have instruments there and temperature instruments too that would be standard for aircraft, like airliners fly.
Sure. Now, you were talking about the damage that could happen to these instruments. Did that sometimes mean that toward the end of the flight the data was corrupted or gone or invalid? I mean, what kind of damage are we talking about to these sensors?
Well, it would actually break sometimes, and so the data would disappear. If, for instance, the liquid water content of a cloud, well, it's a very sensitive type of instrument, and it depends upon small sensing elements, and if that gets hit by a hailstone, it'll break it. Well, when that happens, the data from that instrument goes to zero. You get nothing after that if it's broken. So there are other ways of maybe recreating or estimating what that instrument would have put out, but you have to do without it. And if you have more than one instrument there that's recording the same thing, then of course you have redundancy in the actual data, but more often than not, we would end up with having to estimate what the missing data might have looked like if that occurred. There are certain things that you don't want to estimate, like the pressure. Well, there's the dynamic pressure that measures your airspeed. Then there's the static pressure that measures your altitude. And then there's the change in the static pressure that measures your rate of climb or descent. Those things you don't want to estimate too much. You want to have real good data on, and that's why we had multiple instruments recording those.
So you might be out in the field between flights physically repairing these. So
Yes.
you had spare parts and you had redundant things so that you could recreate, get it ready for the next day.
Yes,
So you got to have your hands on a lot of this. You weren't just designing things.
right.
And typically you'd be out there in the field for what, a few weeks at a time for the summer?
Yes, a few weeks, sometimes 6 weeks, sometimes even a little bit longer.
And did you just stay out there the whole time, or would you come back for the weekends or take a break, or? How
If
did-
it was a project far away, we would generally not get to come back. We'd just have to stay in the field for the entire duration. If it was a project that was relatively close, like in Wyoming, every couple of weeks, we probably might take a day or two off and come home. But even that's kind of a long drive, and when the scientists are in the field, they want to get every opportunity for gathering data they can, so they don't like to take days off.
Did lightning affect these sensors?
For the most part, no. There was one time, and it was just before I got on the T28 project, that lightning struck one of the radio antennas and burned out a radio, actually burned the antenna off. And that was a wire antenna that went from the fuselage to the tail. And we never flew that type of antenna again. And that radio obviously never flew again either, but for the most part, it seems to me there was one occasion when we may have had some lightning affect an instrument, and I can't remember anything that was significant. So most of the time, even when there were recorded direct strikes to the airplane, we never really had a failure of the instrumentation or the computers.
In terms of sensor development, were there other sensors besides the hail sensor that you worked on personally here developing?
Well, the one that comes to mind is there's accelerometers. So accelerometer measuring what kind of forces are being transmitted to the airplane by turbulence and so forth. I did a lot of work with different types of accelerometers and developing those instruments to record the kind of turbulence there. Also the temperature probes. Temperature probes are kind of interesting, and I modified the basic instrument that was developed at NCAR called a reverse flow thermometer, where the air actually goes in the tail backwards, so that it's a lot slower, but it doesn't accumulate ice when it does that. I modified that so that it would be more robust and put it into a different sensing technology, so that was one of those that I developed. I should probably take a look at some of the other instruments here, because I really didn't. Early on too, there was the only way that the scientists on the ground could tell where the airplane was was by using a radar on the ground, a tracking radar. So it's kind of like air traffic control is today. And with an air traffic control radar that they had there, it was difficult to tell how precisely where in a storm it was. It was get a good idea, but I think that it might be within a mile or so of finding its real position. So, and besides that, having a weather radar and a tracking radar at the same time, that puts a lot of burden on ground facilities. You've got to have weather radar. But if you could determine where the T28 is at any given time, if you were able to do that without a radar, then it would be a good idea to do that. And I developed a system that used ground navigation, standard navigation instruments, the VOR and DME, and used two DMEs to more precisely record where the T28 was at any given time. And if I transmitted that to the ground by telemetry, then they could see it where he was. Or record it on board, and you could determine after the fact too. That was before GPS.
All in the days before GPS.
Yeah.
Well, Gary, before the tape runs out, I just want to thank you very much for talking with us today.
Sure.
It's been a pleasure.